Hello, today I'm going to be giving you guys my first movie review, and the movie I'm going to be reviewing today is 1917. Disclaimer, this video is going to contain heavy spoilers, so if you want to watch this movie in the full experience, I would recommend watching the movie before you watch this video. So 1917 was released in 2019. It was directed by Sam Mendes, who also gave us Jarhead, and it stars George Mackay and D. Charles Chapman. And the story of 1917, if you have these two characters, Lance Corporals Blake and Schofield, and they're the British Army in World War One. And the story is about them delivering a message to the 2nd Battalion to stop an attack which will lead to a massacre of 1,600 men. Now, firstly, I'm going to address the elephant of the room. Yes, this is a one-shot movie. For those of you who don't know what that is, it is where the entire movie looks like one continuous shot, and in 1917's case, it looks like one tracking shot. And the film does indeed look like one shot, with one exception. About halfway through the movie, Lance Corporal Schofield, he gets knocked out, it cuts to black, and then it jumps forward several hours later to where he wakes up at night. And many of the cuts are brilliantly hidden. When I was originally watching the movie, I was trying to catch any hidden cuts I could find. I counted about 14, but there are almost 60 throughout the entire movie. And a bunch of that is brilliantly handled by cinematographer Roger Deakins. And the way that they did that was, while some scenes did involve CGI to help move the characters along, it also used a bunch of basic tricks that have been around for a while, including the matching colors trick, which has been around since Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, which came out in 1948. And I think the trick I saw used the most was the foreground object trick. For those of you who don't know, it's where an object passes in the foreground, and then that's either supposed to draw your attention or it's supposed to hide things in the background while they're changing. Now, those of you that know me know that I do love this movie. It has definitely become one of my favorite war movies of all time. I would rank it right next to Mel Gibson's Hacksaw Ridge, Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, and even Zack Snyder's 300, which I don't know if that's a popular opinion or not. Now, I know that is pretty high praise, but the film itself does involve various quality and artistic reasons to not only exist, but to be worthy of that praise. Now, the story of 1917 is pretty simplistic. It's just about two soldiers delivering a message. I do think that they were trying to go for a more avant-garde approach with trying to do a lot with very little. A very good example of that is the movie Buried, starring Ryan Reynolds. But I also feel like it was a story that was kind of created out of limitations. Because it's one tracking shot, you can't get very far away from the characters, and because of that, you're not going to have a bunch of establishing shots or big action spectacles, unless it's from the character's point of view. But the film does make up for that by having the majority of the story just focus on the journey instead of the action, which is a very interesting approach for a war movie. And said journey that the movie takes you on, it spends a great deal of time just showing not necessarily the war, but how the war has affected these landscapes. In the very first act of the movie, very early on, it takes you through a kind of a tour of no man's land, which, because of the war, has become a barren wasteland. And the film also passes through two villages, which are not only basically abandoned, but they're also in rubble. And one of the villages is actually on fire when the movie takes you there. And in the first and third act, it actually spends quite a bit of time in the army bases, just showing the militaristic life of these soldiers. And speaking of militaristic life, you actually do get sort of a character dichotomy between Lance Corporals Blake and Schofield. While Blake is very enthusiastic and he wants to get home to his family, Schofield starts out kind of consumed by the war and even says it's easier not to go back at all. The film also takes an interesting approach because very few times in the movie do you actually see any enemy resistance. I don't know if this is a callback to Jarhead, but only a few times do you actually see Germans in the movie. Although even though that is the case, throughout the entire movie you do feel this element of suspense. Not only because there could have been any misinformation and Germans could be hiding right around the corner, but the few times that there are enemies in the movie, the film does make sure to put you right in the character's shoes so that not only do you feel like you're with them, but you're also discovering things at the same time as the characters. Another thing about the suspensefulness of the movie, there were two moments in the movie where the jump scares really did startle me. The first was down in the Nazi bunker when the rats set off the bomb, and then the second one was when Schofield was crossing the bridge and a German soldier started firing at him. Now, even though I had seen the scene before and was expecting it, it still got me. And because you feel like you're with these characters, by the end of the film, you are kind of just exhausted just from seeing it all. Now, the good news is that at the beginning of the third act, the film does give you kind of a break after the river scene. It kind of takes it slow from Schofield floating down the river to climbing up the hill, and he does eventually reach the 2nd Battalion. But the way that the scene is structured is kind of interesting because it's portrayed in a very calm, almost heavenly way. And when he goes to the 2nd Battalion, and you hear one soldier singing. The song he sings is "The Wayfaring Stranger," and it's a beautiful song. And the way it's presented is very mellow and echoey. Again, almost like it's heavenly. Also, the song "Wayfaring Stranger" is performed by Josh Slavic. I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but if you want to hear a more heavenly version of the song, you should listen to the original studio version. Now, in an interview, I heard that it was structured this way because at this point in time, Schofield believes that he himself is dead, and following the journey, you really can't blame him for thinking that, especially since very early on in the story, Lance Corporal Blake dies by getting stabbed in the stomach, so he probably thinks that he himself would be next. And once he reaches the 2nd Battalion, the rest of the scene is just a race to get down to Colonel Mackenzie, who is in command of the 2nd Battalion, and just get there before all these men are sent to their deaths. Now, following this scene, there's also in my opinion, one of the greatest dramatic moments in any war movie where Schofield realizes that he doesn't have the time to just meander through the trenches. He actually has to get out of the trench and run there. Although, as he's doing that, the first wave of the battalion is sent over to attack. Now, not only does this create a great spectacle, but it also puts even more stress on the characters because technically this attack has already happened, and now instead of preventing it, it's just a matter of stopping it. Also, along the way, Schofield bumps 2 times into some soldiers and he gets knocked down. And fun fact, that was actually a mistake for filming, but I think it makes the scene better because the camera continues to pull away. It really makes you feel the time crunch because it's not stopping for him, so he has to continuously catch up. And then once that scene is over, he does reach Colonel Mackenzie, and Benedict Cumberbatch makes a cameo as that character, and he stops the attack, and that's pretty much where the movie ends. You can tell by the final shot of the movie, not only does it end where it begins, but you can see Schofield himself kind of comes out a changed man. The only downside is there is still a year left in the war. Also, something I found out was that this movie was completely made by British people. The actors are British, the directors and writers are British. Because of that, I don't know if you could call this a foreign film. You probably could. It's also the first movie I've seen where Benedict Cumberbatch is able to use his natural English accent. Now, another interesting way in which the story was told is because it's uncut, the movie plays out like it's in real time. Pretty much every second of the movie is supposed to feel like it's playing out in real time, and it does look like that. Once again, that's just more emphasis on the time crunch that these characters are on. I also do have to give some credit to the writers of this movie. In the first 7 minutes of the movie, you are introduced to the characters, you're introduced to the plot, and you know what's at stake, and you know why these characters are doing what they're doing. And you're also introduced to all these characters that you need to know about. So for that, I do have to give a bunch of credit to the writers. That way the rest of the story is just about their journey. It's probably also worth mentioning that this movie is rated R, although what's interesting about that is that the biggest reason for it is actually language. They say fuck around 20 times in the movie. Originally when I was watching it, I remembered this is 1917, so would these characters be swearing as much as they do? I really don't know, but I also remember that they are in a war, there are soldiers in a war, so they probably have a bunch of pent-up stress already built up. But the interesting part is, it's a war movie, so you'd think if anything, they'd be R-rated for graphic depictions of violence. But that's just another interesting thing about Sam Mendes is that he's able to tell a compelling war story without having to rely on violence, much like in Jarhead. Now that being said, the film itself doesn't shy too far away from violence in a war. The biggest example of that is when Schofield is traversing through the burning city. He's trying to stay hidden, and in doing so, he ends up strangling a German soldier to death. Now, I have heard some people debate on whether or not him doing that was necessary, and to add more controversy to it, the soldier was a kid, probably younger than him. Now, my personal take on that is kind of indifferent, because on one hand, he probably could have just run away and not changed anything, especially since he ended up noticing him anyways. But on the other hand, he probably wasn't willing to take that risk, and being in the war for 3 years already, he probably already has a killer instinct built up inside of him. Other than that, the only real violent part of the movie is when Blake gets stabbed, but even that's mostly off screen, and it's mostly just about the effects of it. Also, something that those two scenes have in common is that it shows the sort of shows the dark side of showing mercy in a war, because both times their plans had backfired. Blake wants to save the German pilot and he gets stabbed for it, and then later on, Schofield tries to keep the German soldier quiet. He doesn't, so he ends up strangling him. And I think that's just another good way of showing the brutality of war. Not necessarily what you have to do, but also what you have to become if you want to survive. Now, something else from the movie I do want to talk about is the soundtrack composed by Thomas Newman. And personally, I do love Thomas Newman. I don't think he gets anywhere near the amount of recognition that he deserves. And his soundtrack, much like his other tracks, are very orchestral and they're very flowy and mellow. But at the same time, he does provide you with all the emotions you're supposed to have. In action scenes, he can make you feel scared, sad, pumped up, sort of enlightened in a way. In other scenes, like in the beginning of the movie, it's very calm and it's very casual, which is not something I expected to feel in a war movie. Then my favorite piece from the movie, 1600 Men, that is definitely one of the most dramatic pieces I've ever heard in a war movie. Not only because of how much it continuously builds up throughout the piece, but it also tells you exactly what you're supposed to see. It's also probably worth mentioning that this movie was shot in England, and throughout the entire movie, at least most of it, it does show just kind of meadows and farmland and small villages. It's not too interesting to look at, but it's not anything worth marking the movie down for. However, that might have been intentional because a good chunk of the movie is spent in trenches, and because it was all uncut, they actually had to orchestrate the entire sets for the movie. And because the movie is mostly about moving, they had to cut out hundreds of feet of trenches and forests and battlefields. So yes, this movie did end up being quite expensive. So I think that's all there is to talk about with 1917. If you couldn't tell, I do love this movie. A rating, I would give it a 9 out of 10. If there was something I was going to change, it would probably be have Blake's death be later in the story, because I believe it happens within the first 30 minutes, and because of that you haven't grown very attached to this character. Plus, it's not very reflective of formulaic writing, although maybe that was the point. So guys, thanks so much for watching. I'm super excited to have my first movie review out. I do hope to do more in the future, and I'll see you guys next time.